All right.
Here we are.
Live.
Here we are.
Yeah.
Who knew? Who would have thought? Good to see you again, John.
Likewise. Been an interesting week for me, but I guess we've been off 2 weeks. So
2 weeks, yeah.
Yeah, and
Life comes up.
Indeed, in many ways, different ways. And the one thing I'm happy about though is that 2 weeks ago or a week and a half ago I started a new Insight community on the campus here.
That's great.
Which I will at some point, it'll be called Southside Insight, I suppose, and hopefully the Insight organization in Chicago, which has been around for a while, will become one of the sponsors, as well as the Spiritual Life Office here. Anyway, so I started this last Thursday evening, and a group showed up, and then this Thursday evening a completely different group showed up, and three students who were pretty new to meditation, and another gentleman who's a medical student who had sat with me on one of the day-longs I did earlier, or actually last year. Anyway, at the end of the session, he asked me, in a sense, to give an elevator pitch, on Insight versus Zen.
Big question. Hard to give an elevator pitch on that, but yeah.
Right, and I said as much. I said, well, I love them both, and there is difference. But of course, Zen is based on all the traditions are based on the earlier traditions. I mean, they start from that place and then kind of bring in other aspects of the teachings, many of which are there anyway, but they hadn't, in the early teachings, but have been received in different ways. And as someone who sort of at the moment, I mean, I'm rooted, as are you, in the earlier tradition. I even think calling it the Theravada tradition isn't exactly accurate, but in the Pali tradition, I suppose we could say that. Mm-hmm. But also, in my case, I've done a fair amount of practicing in the Zen Chan tradition, certainly, and some Zen traditions. Going on a little Zen retreat at the end of the month, actually, over a weekend, with a wonderful teacher. And so, yeah, I had a bit of a challenge, except to say that, well, there's a clarity in the early traditions that is very, the instructions are quite obvious, and there's the investigative aspect, which is really important when it comes to insight. It isn't necessarily highlighted in the Chan traditions as much, and for me that's really important, as well as the relationship to dukkha and suffering on an individual level, mm-hmm. which is important in terms of the current modern mindfulness traditions. That are all very clear in the early traditions. And when we start getting into Chan and Zen, there are beautiful, beautiful things in those traditions, to say nothing about the Tibetan traditions, which I don't know a lot about. And, so the compassion practices and the whole relationship to emptiness is expanded and beautiful in those traditions, and yet the meditation instruction is, in Zen traditions often just sit. In some of the Chan traditions, it's more like asking questions, which is a form of inquiry in a sense. Mm-hmm. And so, and of course, there's in Joseph Goldstein's beautiful book from many years ago, One Dharma, like when things, sort of arrived in the various traditions arrived in this country through various means, and then in some cases got intertwined, and sort of we created a Dharma in this country that's different than in other countries. And mm-hmm. how do we hold all of that? So I know you've given a number of you've done a number of videos on this, and I'm just let's just see where the discussion goes.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an enormous question. And, you can ask it about any two traditions, such as insight and Zen, or you can ask it of sort of all the traditions at once, sort of how do we hold the fact that there's so many different approaches to the Dharma, to practice. And so there's that. And then there's also the bigger question about like all spiritual traditions, right? I mean,
Sure.
what is the difference between a spiritual tradition that's Buddhist and one that's non-Buddhist? There's often comparisons made between Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta, for example, or Hindu traditions, or certain Christian traditions, or whatever. I mean, there are so many.
There are overlaps. Yeah, there are definitely overlaps. Yeah, and especially on the mystical side.
Exactly, on the mystical side, mostly. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, so all of these, this is just an enormous question, and there's so many different ways we can approach it that are, I think, all valid, but not, but aren't they're mutually exclusive, but valid in a certain sense. I mean, from a, I tend to look at things from a scholarly point of view. And Bhikkhu Analayo a while ago did a video, which I'm not remembering the name of, but in any event, he was discussing this question about different traditions in Buddhism. And he made the point that, there basically are two ways to look at this. One of them is to sort of think of them as all the same in some way, and one of them is to think of them as different. And while Analayo says that each of the traditions are valid in their own way, they're not the same. I mean, that they're arguing different things. They're making different claims, or they're making non-claims. They're not making the same claim, right? And that his point of view was that the sort of one Dharma kind of Goldstein approach was sort of like, turning it all into a kind of a gray mush, that wasn't quite, I mean, it's good from 10,000 feet, you can say, oh, it all looks similar. And it is in one way, and in one framing. But when you get close, then you notice that there are lots of differences in practices, in approaches, in, the way the Dharma is structured. I mean, a perfect example of that being the Lotus Sutra, where you have this whole reframing of the early material, where, we have a picture of the Buddha basically saying, everything I told you before was, just a manner of speaking. And really what I wanted to say was something completely different. And, I mean, that's one way to look at it. But certainly there are a lot of people within, let's say, the Theravada tradition or early Buddhist traditions who are going to push back on that and say, wait a second. I mean, the Buddha never lied to us, and, that kind of thing.
Right.
And so, I mean, I think that's why I say that, from a scholarly point of view, these are very different. You have to look at them as different traditions, different approaches, different claims, different practices. But from another point of view, particularly from a sort of I would say, almost sort of Western 19th, 20th century sort of religious Unitarian point of view, they all sort of come to the same place in this kind of mystical unity or experience of something, which is eventually not describable. And when you frame it in those terms, then you can sort of say, oh, they're all going to that same place, in the same way maybe that Christians from their own tradition are getting that same place of this mystical unity or oneness or experience.
I mean, actually, one of my principal teacher in the early aughts, Matt Flickstein, did a whole film on that called With One Voice. And he interviewed people, teachers from almost every tradition, who all were pointing to the same thing, whether it was Advaita, Jewish, Catholic, Christian, Buddhist, obviously, and and it was fascinating, that on that aspect, looking
Mhm.
at that side of it. Um, and and then I'm just thinking about, my partner Upadi's, tradition, which is and other new traditions that have come up.
Mhm.
I mean, the Triratna tradition, which brings together various elements from all three of the
Mhm.
yanas.
Mhm.
And then also there's the Wan Buddhist tradition from Korea, which is quite large, and has I don't know enough about it, but I mean it's a relatively 100-year-old tradition. I think it's sort of in the early 19th century or early 20th century or late 19th century. And it's interesting to see how they evolve, um, and yet, like, what is the relationship with dukkha? That's one way of
Mm.
looking at it. It's like,
Yeah.
what is awakening?
Mhm.
What is awakening in one tradition versus awakening in another tradition?
Absolutely, and
You
these
know,
things can be very
and
different. Yeah.
yeah, but well, or at least they sound different, but are they different? That's the question.
Well, they're
And
framed very
yeah,
differently. I mean,
yeah,
certainly the early tradition frames enlightenment completely differently than we find it in the later Mahayana traditions. I mean, enlightenment in the early tradition is something that you do not, that there's no answer to whether you survive it or not. You have no influence in the world after you die when you're enlightened. And in a lot of polemical stuff in the Mahayana, you have this claim that that's all wrong, that that's a misunderstanding, that those aspects of the early tradition are false, and that in fact, the real Buddhas have effects in the world long after they pass.
hmm
Um, and those are just different. They're different understandings of what nirvana or enlightenment actually entails, and all the things that are that go on. Now, I mean, this is where we're getting into the sort of this is why these are such difficult questions, because
sure,
you can say that from the spiritual, from the subjective side, the experience perhaps is of this undescribable something, and maybe that they're both experiencing the same undescribable something. Um, but the claims made about what happens to you after that experience are quite different, or what could happen, or what you're able to do, and
sure.
whether you're able to survive it or whether you're not able to survive it, or all these kinds of uh, you know uh, conceptual framings
Right, and
of
so
what
the
goes
real
on.
to me, what it really comes down to, though, is for personally, I mean, it's like, okay, how is it impacting my life,
Right. Hmm.
right? I mean, enlightenment aside, you know, um, what's changed in my life, and
Hmm.
would it be different in one versus the other?
Hmm.
And sure, there are various devotional practices that vary from one tradition to another. The chants are different. The whole relationship to, or the whole concept of bodhisattva is somewhat different.
Hmm.
There's all, when you read those later suttas, the Mahayana suttas, it's like, man, it's there. The imagination is incredible,
Hmm.
and the imagery is fantastic. And some of the early traditions had that. That would be really cool. And there is, of course, some imagery in the early teachings, but nothing like that.
Right.
And how does one relate to that? How does one? And it's to me, that's quite fascinating.
Hmm.
At the same time, it's like, well, okay, what how does it impact this manifestation,
Right. Well,
right?
I mean, another aspect related to all of this with the different traditions in Buddhism that may touch more on how it relates to you as a practitioner is the guru focus within the Tibetan tradition
Yeah, of
and some
course.
aspects of Zen,
Yeah,
where there's
absolutely.
this idea that the only
Absolutely.
way to get the Dharma properly is a sort of a wordless transmission from the guru to the student,
Yeah,
and that without that guru transmission, there's really nothing learned. And you don't find that in the early tradition. That's never
true.
mentioned.
Yeah, no, that's a really important, very
And
important fact.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one way that, one has to decide for oneself as, subjectively as a student, as a Dharma student, what kind of approach fits with
Right.
with you, what resonates and what doesn't resonate. Now, the guru focus does not resonate with me personally. I push back on that. That's just how I've been brought up in a very academic environment where that kind of faith, and to me it seems like clinging to one person's advice, without, sort of in blindly. I can't do that, and I don't feel that that's right for me. But some people find that the best way for them, and that's
Absolutely.
fine, as long as you're careful about it. As long as you're careful about it and retain a little bit of your own, objective ability to know when you're being abused in a relationship.
Well, yeah.
As long as you can do that and leave
Yeah.
if you feel that you're being mistreated. Obviously many teachers are very ethical and great and do teach wonderful things, and as long as they're doing what they should be doing, which most of them are, then it's great. It can be great.
That'll be another podcast.
That would be another podcast. Yes.
But yes, and I think another side of that is, because I've seen this too, where somebody is like, in a sense, taking pride in their guru. In other words, the fact that they have one, it's like the practice is all about that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And that, to me at least, seems a little not dangerous, but there's something missing.
Yeah.
You
can get the pride too. Pride, my guru is better than your guru, kind of thing.
Well, there's that. No, that's what I guess that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And I've had certainly powerful relationships with certain teachers, and that's been a really major aspect of my own practice and development. And that's really important. I'm sort of in your camp on it when it comes to having a guru. I think there's a sort of midway, a middle path on that level too.
Yeah.
And and of course we also know of stories with the Buddha where he had an interaction with one person and they would be enlightened immediately. And that's because of that powerful presence, theoretically. And so but yes, that you're right. That's a huge part of the difference in traditions. I should say that I also when it comes to other religions altogether, because I was brought up in a very Reformed Jewish household, and never really identified as a religious Jew, and yet I've done a lot of teaching in a Jewish context, and I've done for many years, sort of co-taught a community with a rabbi, and the similarities. There are a lot of linkages between, especially the early traditions, and certain teachings in the Jewish tradition. And then there's also the devotional aspect, which can play a role in both traditions if one goes that direction. So I think that's all really fascinating to find, the common themes between traditions. And then, of course, there's Unitarianism, which has a lot of. I do a monthly talk for one of the Unitarian churches in New York, because they have a big Buddhist program, and the similarities there. But that's different than what we're talking about in terms of Buddhist traditions and how they. I think what's interesting, and I'm looking for. I have Nalia's book on the early Prajnaparamita teachings, the early Mahayana teachings, which just came out. It's like fitting on my desk. It's quite thick, but half of it is footnotes, I realized.
I haven't read it. I haven't got a copy yet, but that sounds like
it's going to be interesting. I'm looking forward to it. And what I find is that, a few years ago, I had, and maybe this is somebody we'll have on a guest because he's just come out with a new book, uh, Ben Connolly, who's written some beautiful books on the Yogacara traditions. He's a Zen teacher in Minneapolis. He just came out with a book on the flower garland teachings. And with the Yogacara books, there were some fascinating teachings that came through that for me, which I then tended to look at, and it gave me a new way of looking at karma in particular.
Mm.
And I found really helpful.
Mm.
And so I guess, maybe I'm picking and choosing what works for me, but also what I find helpful in teaching.
Yeah.
And so, it's really, to me, that's really important. And, there's, and when I work with my teachers, Tanisara and Kittasaro, who are, straight out of the Thai forest tradition, but also heavily influenced by certain Chan traditions, particularly around Kuan Yin. And we do retreats, and we're chanting from both traditions, and that works. And so I think that, again, as I said earlier, it's how it impacts our own lives, and finding what works for me, and then what I can communicate that might work for others. And even in the early traditions, of course, as we know, that one of the reasons there are so many teachings in the early traditions is because the Buddha talked differently to everyone.
Yeah.
I mean, in a sense, right? And so to some degree, the later teachings are like that too, I suppose. I don't know. I mean, it's just one way of looking at it as well.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at it from a number of different framings. I think to me, you were saying that it's a certain amount of picking and choosing what's good for you, and I think that's something all of us do.
Yeah.
There's a sort of a fundamentalism that is in a certain part of every tradition.
Sure, of course.
that says, picking and choosing is a problem, and you have to be, if you're going to do it, you should do it 100% the way we say is right, and leave all that other stuff to the side. And that is that's one way to do it. I mean, there are people who go very far that way, and people who just love that, who think, who revel in the in the purity of their own approach.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think what's important, and this is why it works for me, I think. I mean, I was fortunate, and that I was working with Matt Flickstein for as many years as I did, who was deeply grounded in Theravada. I mean, his major teacher was Bhante Gunaratana. So from that Sri Lankan Theravada tradition, really entrenched in that, and that had a big influence on me. So I felt that was the grounding, and with a grounding, with a kind of, for me anyway, with that kind of being rooted in one tradition, and then bringing in other aspects of some of the other traditions that help expand a bit on what I was already experiencing, and maybe bring another perspective, which for me at least proved really helpful.
I mean, I think if it's done properly, and if it's done carefully by a good teacher, it just expands your repertoire. It gives you more tools to work with. It gives you more approaches to frame things and understand them, and it can be wonderful. On the other hand, I think there is a danger that some of the more traditional people will say, in every tradition, that you can get yourself confused.
Of course, absolutely.
Because the different approaches, the different traditions do have different approaches. And so, in one approach you'll say X, and another approach you'll say not X. You'll say, the early Buddhist approach is one of let's say, just to take an example, effort, strong effort, that is highlighted in early Buddhism. But in a lot of Zen, there's the idea of non-effort and giving
Right.
that up, and
Non-doing. Yeah.
non-doing. And if you hear those two in the wrong context together, it may
Right.
just confuse you, and just
Yeah.
so you get to a point where you're like, I don't know what to do. I don't know if I'm supposed to do this or not do it or what. And I'm just, and people get people do legitimately
Yeah.
get confused and sort of
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
really know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
the fact is they're both legitimate. They're both legitimate teachings. Just in Ajahn Chah's sense, of you're walking down the road, and if you're going too far to the left, he'll say go to the right, and if you're going too far to the right, he'll say go to the left. So
Right.
they're opposite teachings, but they're it's to the point of the particular practitioner that they're being given. And if you understand them in that way, then you can say, oh, okay, so it's not that there's something wrong. It's just that they're being given to different people at different times.
Yeah.
Or in different different contexts. So, I think one of the reasons that I prefer, at least, to stick to, in general, I do. People will know I do stuff in the later tradition as well, but mostly in the early tradition is just because, I have a limited amount of bandwidth, and there's only so much that I can really understand, and and so I just find it easier to try to delve deeply into one tradition, and try to understand really what that one is about, and understand the other ones in the light of that tradition. And you can do that with any tradition. You can take Tibetan tradition or Zen or whatever, Pure Land, and understand the other ones in light of that tradition. That's fine, but you'll get a different kind of approach depending on how you do that.
And what I find interesting is that some of the some teachers in the later traditions in particular, they're so entrenched in those traditions, they're not even aware of the earlier traditions.
Well, that's definitely a problem. Yeah, that's definitely true.
And that kind of shocked me when I realized that.
Yeah, and I've found that in scholarship as well. Some of the leading scholars of the Mahayana, I've heard, I'm not going to say names, but some of the leading scholars of Mahayana, the big names, I've heard lectures by them where they just get fundamental things wrong about the early tradition. And it's clear from the way they speak that not only do they not know about the early tradition, but they don't know that they don't know. That they really, because the Mahayana, there is an aspect of Mahayana teaching that really denigrates stuff that was pre-Mahayana. Thinks of it as Hinayana, as lesser, and that really sort of just doesn't approach it in any kind of serious way. And that, I think that's a problem. And it's a problem in academia as much as it is, frankly, in some Mahayana schools. Now, not all. There are always going to be exceptions, but that is a problem.
Yeah. Anyway, it's a really great. I think the important thing, for those who are listening, who are sort of maybe wondering themselves, right? To me, at least, what's important is ground yourself in one, but know the others, and take advantage of what's available to us now, because so much is available that wasn't a long time ago. And it's like, okay, well, how does this particular teaching from a later tradition shed light on something from an earlier tradition, and vice versa? And how does that impact my practice personally, if it does?
And if you're coming into Buddhism just as a beginner, like this guy who was asking me this question,
he wasn't quite a beginner, but
well, let's just assume he was a beginning. For the beginners listening to this, podcast, there's no wrong answer, in the sense that you can go to a bunch of different ones. Try to open yourself up to 3 or 4. If you have the time, you can just listen to, you can go to visit actual temples or different approaches. And if you don't have the time, at least looking at, maybe videos from the different approaches, and find which one resonates with you, and if something doesn't resonate with you, fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Just pick another one.
Yeah. It's interesting, because at the end of any MBSR class, mindfulness-based stress reduction class, I hand out a bunch of resources, and then I say, it's like, this particular curriculum is mostly rooted in the early traditions. You will be completely comfortable if you go to an insight center or an insight retreat, nothing will seem foreign to you. The language is slightly different, but that's it. If you go to a Zen Sangha or other Mahayana traditions or Tibetan traditions, that will be very different, on one level, but it might resonate. So you've got to see. So we're fortunate to live where we live and at the time we live in terms of just what's available and out there, and they're all welcoming, and it's like when you look at which traditions are the fastest growing, you'll be surprised. And so it's a great time to be practicing, I'd say, and for sure.
And often it'll just depend on the people in your local sangha. Oftentimes
there may only be one, too, depending on where
only be one, and you go and they're really great people, and you really like everybody, and you like the vibe, and you go to a different one, and you just for whatever reason it just doesn't click. And okay, well there you go. You've made your at least that's your entry, and get started and find out.
Yeah, for sure. So anyway, this has been fun.
Yeah.
Now I know how to. Now I can just recommend this gentleman look at our podcast.
There you go.
And we forgot to mention coffee.
Coffee, yes, coffee. In every tradition they need coffee, I think.
That's true. Well, some are more tea oriented, but we don't talk about that. Right. So yes, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can go to our website, diggingthedharma.com, and buy us a cup of coffee or 2 or 3 or 4, and
or
they will
become a member of the coffee donating group.
Right. And we will be off for a few weeks, I think, because I'm actually having my cataract removed on my right eye in a couple of weeks, and next week I'm going to be on the short retreat with which maybe I'll talk about. Speaking of different traditions, it's with Wow Gu, who's a major teacher in the Dharma drum tradition, Zen tradition, Chan tradition, which the only contact I've had with him was a conversation he had with Nalio, actually.
Oh, cool.
Which was fascinating, and they have a very good rapport with each other and understanding of each other, and it's. I'm really looking forward to meeting him and being with him for a weekend. So. We will be back.
We will be back.
And until then, keep digging the Dharma.
Dharma.
Okay. See ya.